Story, story night. Story, story, good night. Beginning, middle, now at the end. So as artistic director and host of the flagship season of Story, Story Night, I end every show with that song, which was originally an instrumental piece, and we wrote lyrics for it because I felt like we needed something that acknowledged the ending of the show, something that really let everybody know, here we are, we've arrived, we're at the end of the show. And it kind of, what I had in my mind was I wanted my Carol Burnett moment from the Carol Burnett show. That's a new Hulu show you can stream if you don't know. She had this whole like, I'm so glad we had this time together. And I felt like we needed that moment to see the angels pass, maybe. And I think about endings quite a bit. Story, Story Night is a live storytelling show. True stories told live on stage without notes. And it happens almost every month. We're also a podcast. StoryStoryNight.org has all the different things that are happening with that. But in thinking about endings, I go to a lot of movies, and just recently I was at one of the best films ever made, I'm sure. It's called The Hustle. And but one thing that it did that movies always used to do, and hardly any of them do anymore, is before the credits, the words "the end" appeared on the screen. And I really felt something in that moment, not just kind of nostalgic, but also it's, I guess people say that when you have a near end of life experience, a common thing is for your whole life to flash before your eyes. And I realized when seeing that the end at that movie that sort of happened for me with the film. I suddenly sort of flashed back to all the events in the film, and it was kind of a moment to like recycle that. Another movie that I saw recently was Spider-Man: Homecoming. And this is an example of what's happening now with modern films more so, is there's this shying away from there being an ending. So now, you know, you never used to see audiences sit through the credits. And for some of the movies now, you can tell which ones there isn't an ending because the audience is still there, and the ones that people figured out, there's nothing, and they all leave. Because after the credits, there's more to the story. Usually it sets up for the continuation, for the sequel. Some of the movies are being a little hopeful with that, but they do it anyway. And that's what happens there. So it's kind of like we miss the ending. And I'm reminded in particular of a movie that is, I think it's from the 80s. In the States, it was called The Big Blue. In France, it was called Le Grand Bleu. And it had two different endings, and I did not know this. But in the American version, or the version that was released in America, it's about a deep sea diver, the kind that don't use oxygen or anything, they just hold their breath. I don't know what that's called. And in the American version, he dives under the water, and he comes up in the morning, and there are dolphins jumping over him, and the sun has somehow risen, even though I'm pretty sure when he dove it was nighttime. So, but in the French version, that doesn't happen. It's pretty suggestive that he never came up again. And so I'm wondering if culturally we have an aversion to endings, that we don't want things to end, or we're not prepared to deal with an ending. We tend to think of negative things like death or divorce or ending a business, which is seen as a failure. But there is a positive side to endings, and of course, one of the things about endings too is sometimes it's hard to see them. We're having an ending right now. When you think about the word breakfast, break fast, it's the end of your fast, unless some of you were snacking before you got here this morning. And so seeing the ending is an important thing too. And in thinking about the endings in my life, I kind of saw two different versions of endings. There were the endings that I instigated, and there were the endings that sort of happened to me. And initially, my response was, oh, okay, the endings that happen to me, those are going to be the ones that have the darkest outcome or the more negative outcome, and the endings that I initiated will be better. But I'm interested in what the difference in that is. And one of the things also that's sort of interesting about coming to you in the context of Story Night is that this is a little bit of a hybrid, because in our show, we don't tell people how to apply the things in our story, the events in our lives. We don't necessarily say, here's what happened to me, and this is how it's going to help you. We say, this is what happened to me, and then it's up to you to figure that out. So if I'm not inspiring or inspiring innovation, it's on you. Yeah. So one of the first endings for me that's really big in my mind is that I lost my father when I was 23. My little sister was only 9. And that was obviously an ending that happened to me. And I'm not going to dwell on that one today because breakfast, and also I'm going to focus more on professional endings as opposed to personal endings. But I do want to acknowledge that often the endings in our lives that have the most significant impact are the personal endings, endings of relationships or losing a loved one. Those are big moments in our life. But one of the first endings for me professionally is at 28, I thought I had made it. I thought, I have the job I'm going to have my entire life. And it seemed like a huge achievement at 28. I was the artistic director of a puppet theater. And that maybe doesn't sound like the benchmark. For me, it was a pretty big deal. It was the second largest touring puppet theater in the United States. The person who had that job before me had done it for 30 years. So that was also part of my expectation of why I thought this would be my job for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, I came to a place where when I got up in the morning, the thing I looked most forward to was when I would be going back to bed. And that, I quickly recognized, was not a way to live. And I'm not sure I totally understand why that happened, because it was something I loved. We were sharing stories in creative ways with students all over the country, traveling to elementary schools and presenting these shows. I got to work with musicians and writers and puppeteers and actors and singers. But something dark was happening inside me. And it was scary, but I knew I had to end it. And so I went in and told the general manager, I've got to turn in my notice, which was a surprise. And unfortunately, with that position, I had to give 9 months' notice. So it was kind of an ending that went on and on and on and on and on for several months. And also, one of the things that distinguishes this ending is I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't have a plan. It was just, I knew it had to stop, but I wasn't stopping it because I had something else to do. I was just stopping it. It was just, so, and this was in Portland, Oregon, and what I ended up doing is becoming a singing waiter on a river cruise dining ship that went up and down the Willamette River. And I definitely viewed that as a temporary position until I could figure it out. But I did do that for, I think, close to 3 years. And eventually I decided, okay, maybe this isn't temporary. Maybe this is what I'm going to do. And the next level up was to become a cruise manager. So I said, all right, sign me up to be a cruise manager. And around that same time, I was getting a lot of messages from friends saying, hey, we're hearing about this show that's opening in New York, and it seems like they're asking for you because they want an actor-singer who can also be a puppeteer. And one of the things in the puppetry world is there's a lot of people in that world who are there because they don't want you to see them, their person. They want to hide behind this character. So it is a little challenging, I imagine, when casting a show like that, because in this show, the puppet's here and the person's here, and you do the role simultaneously. You're both acting the role. So that's kind of different. And I thought, oh yeah, that is sort of specific, but I'm in Portland. They're not going to hire someone in Portland to do a show in New York. Come on. So I just was like, okay, when is my training for cruise manager? But a friend of mine who's much more ambitious than I am went to the auditions, and they called and said, hey, I got a call back. They want me to come back again for a second audition. So that kind of took away whatever that was, where I was like, no, I can't do that, no. And so I suddenly was like, maybe I will. I called, I'd missed already several rounds of auditions that had happened in LA and Florida, and now they were down to kind of the wire. So I didn't even know if they would take me, but I called the casting director and I said, you know, I'm in Oregon, a bunch of people are telling me that I should audition for this. If you have a slot, I'll come and do it. And she said, yeah, come in 3 days. So I bought a plane ticket and return date 1 week and flew to New York and went to this audition. And it was super scary. And I thought, wow, do I not belong here? Because I showed up at this audition center in Chelsea, and all the other guys that were there were super fit, super tall, were wearing like dance clothes and like skin tight shirts. And I was wearing like some baggy jeans and a t-shirt or something. And I was like, oh no, I am so in the wrong place. Like, this can't be me. And then someone came out and said, all right, everybody, for Oklahoma dance auditions, please go to Studio B. And all the guys disappeared. And it was just me. And so my audition was in a different room. So I did the audition, and a week later, I got the part. And I found out that I would be starting rehearsals a week after that. So I flew back to Portland, packed a suitcase, quit my job as cruise manager potential for the River Cruise Dining Company, and moved to New York. And for me, that ending is different because I wasn't so much quitting the ship because I felt I had to end it, but I was quitting because I was starting something else. So that was, for me, a big difference between the puppet theater artistic director job and this, was that it was more about starting something than it was about ending something. Now, a Broadway show seems like the kind of thing where it would be more of that first kind of ending, where someone else stops it for you. Because you don't know how long the show's going to run. When you start the show, some shows don't even make it to opening night. They close in rehearsal or in previews before they even open. So as an actor in a show like that, you don't know if this is going to be a month, 3 months, how long. And so, but it actually didn't happen that way because I chose the ending for that. And the show actually continued running. It just closed this last May in New York, so it ran for 16 years, which is a really long run for a show like that. It beat the odds. It won 3 Tonys that year. It opened shows in Vegas and national tours. And I wasn't involved with any of that because a few months into the run, which was super exciting, I was asked to come into the headquarters for Nickelodeon. There in Times Square, in the Viacom building, like somewhere on the 30-something floor, to audition for a television program. And I went to the audition. I thought, well, what do I got to lose? I'll go to the audition. And did it, and got a call that said, hey, we want you to come back for a second audition. Now, my experience from Avenue Q was, if you go to the callback, you should definitely be a yes at that point. The first audition, maybe not. Maybe you're just throwing it out there, testing your skills. But that second audition, you better be a yes if they offer you the job. So I told her, I said, look, I'm not sure I'm ready to end my run with Avenue Q. I mean, we just opened, and it's going really well. I mean, we didn't know how big it was going to be at that time. And so how many people are you casting? And she said 6. And I said, okay, well, how many people are you calling back? And she said 6. And I was like, oh, no, I should say no, because it looks like you're really at the end. And I don't know that I'm going to do it. And to my surprise, she said, well, the creator of the show is coming to meet you. So even if you're not going to say yes, go ahead and come, because that's who he's expecting to see. So come in and do it. So I said, okay. And I thought it was going to be a second audition, but what it really turned out to be was meeting the creator of the show, Magnus Skeving, who was a world aerobics champion, which I still don't really know exactly what that is. But it does mean that he's super fit, super athletic, and has a lot of energy. But he's also really dynamic. And he kind of convinced me to go on this new adventure. And what I didn't mention before is that, because I thought this was a joke when they told me, is the show was going to be filmed in Iceland, in a suburb of Reykjavik. And I was like, what? In Iceland? All right. And, thinking about it, part of it was that I realized I'm not well suited for a show that has the same ending every single night. Repeating exactly the same performance isn't really my energy. I like to be a little more relating to the audience, a little more spontaneous, a little more like in the moment, which is super hard to do when if you take a breath in a different place in the show, the stage manager gives you a note afterwards to say, hey, you breathed in the wrong place in that line. That's pretty intense. Ironically, though, so I thought going to a TV show, hey, we're filming episodes, every episode's different, so there'll be a new ending every single time. Ironically, Lazy Town ends with exactly the same song every single episode. So I didn't really get that, but we do shoot it. It's a song called Bing Bang, and we do shoot it differently every day. And Lazy Town is a kids show that never says this, but what it's really, the mission of it is to combat childhood obesity. So the kids in the show are super active. They're eating healthy foods. We call it sports candy. It has kind of a Europop sense to it, super bright, super technicolor. We had to be super physical in the show with these puppets that were huge. Excuse me, they were designed by Neil Scanlon, who later went on to do a little movie called Star Wars, and came up with this concept for a new droid that has a head on top and the body just spins around. And I've forgotten the name of that character because I'm an R2-D2 guy. I actually have a painting of that droid, though, on my wall. So that was really, really fun, and it seemed like my dream job because I loved it so much. And the cast and crew were from America, from Britain, from Iceland, and they were like a second family. But in that first season, we were there all year, and then the season ended. So Lazy Town had lots of mini endings because you would shoot a season and then you'd be off for a while, shoot another season, off for a while. And after that first season, I came back to the United States and I didn't have anywhere to live because I had left from New York. And actually the way I left was pretty amazing because it kind of was like there was no ending. I did my last performance of Avenue Q on Christmas Eve in December 2003, I guess that was. And I had left my apartment in Park Slope, had just my suitcases left, brought them with me to my dressing room, finished my last cue on stage, walked off, went up to the dressing room, got my suitcases, went out the back door, out to the street, took a cab to Newark Airport. I wasn't even there for the final curtain call. I had left before the show even ended. And because my flight was like in an hour or something. So I was like, zoom. So it was really kind of an unfinished feeling because I didn't even end the show. I just got my bags and left. So when I got back to the States, I didn't really have anywhere to live. I felt like I wasn't really finished with New York. Somehow it didn't feel done. So I decided, I'm gonna move to New York. I'm gonna try it. I don't know, there's something unfinished there. And I realized I'd kind of done New York backwards. I sort of started at the end because the first time I went to New York, I already had a job on Broadway, which is usually kind of the end game for most actors. So now I was coming to New York, and actually the taxi picked me up. I had like 3 bags, and he said, "Oh, so what are you doing?" I was like, "I don't know, I'm gonna look for a job." And he kind of looked at me like I just arrived from Ellis Island, or maybe that I was like, had gotten off the bus from somewhere in the Midwest with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, you know? And so I did what I hadn't done before. I went to open call auditions for all sorts of plays and parts that I probably had no business auditioning for. I took workshops, I tried the voiceover world, I got an agent, a couple of different agents, and met a lot of rejection and a lot of what I didn't get the first time I was there, with, just celebrities and everything coming to see us and this kind of thing. So that was pretty hard. And so eventually we did just shoot a second season of Lazy Town. I came back to New York again, and I did get cast in another show that was for PBS called Big Big World, pretty much the opposite of Lazy Town, which is super high energy. Big Big World is about a bunch of animals in the rainforest, and the lead character is a sloth. And I was the right arm of the sloth, which is even weirder. So I'm dressed head to toe in a green suit, and my arm is inside the sloth's arm, and I'm like hugging the back because it's a huge character, like Big Bird kind of, that style of puppet where the puppeteer inside has he'd be like this. He has his hand up inside the head of the sloth, and he's manipulating it this way, and then his left hand, well, there's nothing left for him for the right hand. So you actually have to hire someone to be the right hand. And I kind of have to be inside his head because I have to figure out, well, when is he going to want to gesture with his right hand? Or when is it suddenly that the right, if you are watching television puppetry from a puppeteer's perspective, you can tell when there's a bad right hand. Because it's like got a hole, it's like, look at me. So I had auditioned for that show before and I didn't get it. So it had taken a few years before I got into that show, and I felt like I'd made it. And it was super surreal because we shot it in the Hamptons, and I found out later that the house I was staying in was $10,000 a month. And and it was also, I'd be like eating ice cream and Billy Joel would be there licking a cone, and I was like, where am I? This is so weird. That show, we were going to start season 2, or maybe it was season 3. And the producer called, or the production assistant called and said, we need to delay it a week, and we never heard from him again. And so that ended abruptly. Next show was another PBS show called Nate the Great, which I was doing the voice work for. It was an animated show. I loved that. It was produced by Mowgli Entertainment. I was scheduled for 40 episodes, did about 20. The production assistant called and said, we need to cancel your next session. We'll reschedule. Show collapsed. Mo Green, by the way, is a character in The Godfather who is a mobster, so I almost wondered, was that the whole setup the whole time? It was set up for embezzlement or something? Pretty creative idea. We're gonna do an animated show for Nate the Great. So those were endings that both happened to me. But in looking at those endings, what I've kind of realized is that the endings that I stopped, that I instigated that there wasn't a thing coming up next, are actually the endings that I landed in a happier place. The ones that seem nicer, the ones where it's like there is the start that I'm headed to, that always didn't result in it being a happier experience. And I encourage people to tell their own stories all the time, not just because it's my job that I have right now. And in fact, any of you that want to be a featured storyteller at Story Story Night, just send your pitch to story@storystorynight.org. Our next show is on Tuesday. The theme is Drink Me, because all of our themes are coming from Alice in Wonderland this summer. And the Drink Me is the moment where she falls down the rabbit hole, which was our first theme, the rabbit hole, down the rabbit hole. She sees this nuclear drink me potion that makes her shrink and transform. so that she can go experience Wonderland. And that's Tuesday night at the VAC. We have a show at 7 and 10. And what I often find is people are good at the beginnings, the middles, but they struggle with the ending. And in fact, for this show coming up, I was just working with one of the featureds, and he had a whole paragraph that was, I learned that, I learned that, I learned that. And that wasn't the ending. And we ended up asking him just delete all that, because the other line he had in it about transforming, this guy lost a huge amount of weight. But what he came to say is, I thought that when I transformed, my problems would disappear. What happened is when I transformed, my problems transformed also. And I was like, that's your ending. Not this other I learned stuff that we think is going to enlighten people. Because there's a difference between an observation and adding a moral on an ending. And I think he was trying to add a moral. And an observation just says it as it comes. And the thing that's great about an ending is it's the opportunity to process our lives. It's where we get to reflect back on the things that happened to us. And we often say that when we help storytellers, we call it look at your life like a river and notice the places where the river bends, because that's where something new is happening in your life, and that's kind of the middle. And it's great to know where that middle is, but it's the end where we then can take something from that experience into the next thing that we do. And we call the endings, we have a different word for endings in our materials for preparing stories. We call them landings, which I really kind of like that because it says more about like becoming grounded and looking at where we were. And I just thought of kind of this illusion of like walking along through life and something makes you trip and you fall and you land hard. And that's kind of the Lazzi or the joke or the slapstick. And you could just leave it at that. I find it endlessly entertaining to watch people trip and fall myself. I think there's entire YouTube channels dedicated to just watching that. But what makes it a story is when I get up from that and I go, what just happened? And that's when you move from a joke to a story and something meaningful. And with a landing, there's nothing to say that you can't use that landing to then launch into something else. We're going to do a few questions, I think, but I thought I would do it a little bit differently and I'll go ahead and open the box. And this is what we call the black sheep of the storytelling family. His name is literally Black Sheep 1. He's wearing rabbit ears right now because he's all ready for the late night show of Alice in Wonderland, and he's playing the White Rabbit. Oh, he's missing an arm rod. Well, I'll just use one. And this was actually built by one of the associates that I worked with through Henson. He doesn't work at Henson anymore, neither do I. But he's still building, and so we sent him our logo for Story Late Night, and he created this little character. We use him in the show for what we call the Slammer of Shame, which is actually a moment where, one idea is that someone has a story that's so salacious that they don't want to be seen on stage. So they're hiding in a back room at a microphone, and I lip sync live to their voice with this puppet on the mic, so it looks like the sheep is telling the story. So maybe what I'll do now is I'll have the sheep answer a couple of questions. He might know more than I do. Are there any questions about?
What brought you to Boise?
Well, FedEx. Good answer, Black Sheep. So leaving New York was another forced ending because after I finished Lazy Town, which does seem, I mean, for a while it was like you never could tell where the end was because we kept doing another season. You didn't know if it would happen again. Then you did another season. It does feel like it ended. And I came back to New York and realized I don't want to live here anymore. So I made a list, which was Astoria, Oregon, Portland, Maine, and Boise, Idaho. And the reason Boise is on the list is because my family is all here. And I'm actually 5th generation Boise. I was gone for 25 years, but it's more like a prodigal son returning, I guess. It's a different place than it was when I left, though, for sure. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
So what I do is create events for people, adventures for women. I run adventure groups for women.
Not for sheep.
Not for sheep, unfortunately. Maybe one day. Although we have done some sheep yoga.
I am very flexible.
So,
look at this.
So one of the things I'm really interested in, I've been to Story Night, I'm a big fan. I promote it with our members here in town too. I'm really interested in the ending of an event. Whether it's an event like this, whether it's a hike, whether it's anything we do. I'm really interested in what people want at the ending. And I'm really curious from your perspective with Story Night and the things you've done, what is it, what that groups of people, what do they want to feel when something's over? Like at Story Night, for example. You say you don't want to put a moral at the end. What do you find that people want from you, from Story Night at the end of that night? What do they want to hug? Do they want to feel inspired? You know, what is it that they want?
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about our philosophy of Story Night is we don't really think too much about what the audience's takeaway is. We leave that to them. But there is an answer, I think. But one of the things about that with the story is we think if we tell people, this is how my story relates to you, then you've created one path that those people can take. And some of them, that'll be the perfect path. And some people, it won't be. Whereas if we don't say, this is what you can take from my story, and they come up with their own connection, then you have hundreds of paths, basically one for every audience member. And our idea is that that creates greater connection. And I think that's the answer to the question of what people want, especially today, where I am just as guilty as anybody else of sitting in my living room and streaming Netflix alone in the dark, you know. Well, not always alone. I don't want to be too sad, but and I think what they want, and actually the last part of that song, Story Night, Story Night, the last line is, I may have come here as a stranger, but now I'm leaving as a friend. And I think that's what people are wanting, is to come together and hear these stories and feel like they have met someone, that they know someone, that they understand them in a different way and understand themselves in a different way. And they leave with a feeling of community, which is, I think, what Creative Mornings is trying to do too, is bring people together from all different places. You have to read a name tag to know who it is. But after having that experience together, it feels like you're connected to something. And we hope that that feeling of connection goes beyond even the people in the room. And, you know, we're connected to people all over the place. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to cut you off there.
Okay.
To get everybody out of here at 10 o'clock.
All right.
Thank you, Jodi, so much.
Sure. Hug. You want a hug, right? High five. One another one.